There's a point where research stops helping you make the decision and starts helping you avoid the part where that decision becomes reality. You tell yourself you're being responsible. You're gathering information and learning from people who have done it before. You're just comparing your options and reading reviews and listening to that other podcast and watching another video and saving another post or maybe even signing up for another free training. And at first, I get it. That might be exactly what you need. And there are plenty of times when information can be useful. You don't need to make every decision based on instinct and just hope for the best, which I don't recommend as a complete life strategy. Sometimes you need facts, numbers. You need to understand the timeline, the cost, the next step, the consequences. Research can help you become less vague and more grounded. But then there's the other kind of research, the kind that happens after you already have enough information to take the next small step. That kind gives you the feeling of movement without requiring the risk of being seen. The kind where you keep learning because beginning would expose a vulnerability. It would expose the project to the world, and it would expose the decision you made and even maybe the conversation you've been avoiding. And that's what we're talking about in today's episode, when research is just delayed action.
Welcome to How to Lose the Weight, the podcast for women ready to stop waiting for someday and live life now. I'm your host, Holly Toscanini, and I'm here to help you break free from perfectionism, self-doubt, and the someday mindset. Together, we'll dive into real conversations about self-trust, empowerment, and living authentically. If you're ready to reconnect with your intuition and step into your power, you're in the right place. Let's lose the weight and start living fully right now.
Welcome back to How to Lose the Weight. I'm Holly Toscanini, and over the last few episodes, we've been talking about what happens after the insight. In episode 123, we looked at why understanding your pattern doesn't automatically change it. And in episode 124, we talked about the way personal growth can turn every decision into a test of whether you're doing life right. And last week, we talked about second guessing yourself after you've already made a decision. Now, today, I want to talk about how to know when information is helping you make a grounded decision and when it's quietly become the place where you're just waiting. So this isn't about shaming yourself for wanting information. I want to be very clear about that because a lot of women who listen to this podcast are thoughtful and careful, absolutely responsible people. You're not reckless. And I know you're not trying to blow up everything because somebody on the internet told you that fear means you should take action. You want to understand what you're doing before you do it. That's fair. The problem begins when the standard for understanding enough just keeps moving. You read an article, but then you need to read the book. You listen to the podcast, but then you need the expert interview. You talk to the friend, but then you need somebody else's opinion because that first person was supportive, and somehow support doesn't count unless it comes with some mild objection that you can analyze for 3 days. You keep telling yourself you'll act when you know enough. But somehow enough never arrives. And the reason it never shows up is because the research isn't really trying to answer the practical question any longer. It's trying to protect you from exposure. And that word matters, exposure. Because often the thing we're avoiding isn't the task or the decision itself. It's what the decision makes possible. Sending an application opens a possibility of rejection, and hitting publish on that post means somebody might misunderstand you, and having a difficult conversation to lead to anger, silence, hurt, or disappointment. Research protects you from that because as long as you're still preparing, you don't have to know what happens when your choice meets the world. And for many women, that can feel a lot safer than taking action, especially if you've spent a lot of your life being rewarded for just being prepared. You learn to do your homework and to think ahead and to make that responsible choice. I mean, you consider how your decisions affect other people in your life, and those are good skills. But when you carry those skills into a decision that really requires vulnerability, they're just camouflage. Research shows up like being mature and responsible. It says, I'm just being thorough. I should know more before I move. Maybe it's even saying, I just don't want to make a bad mistake. And all of that sounds really reasonable. And sometimes it is reasonable. But you can usually feel the difference between research that's clarifying something and research that's postponing something. Clarifying research creates a direction, and avoidant research just creates more thought loops. See, when you're gathering necessary information, you usually become more specific. You can see the next step more clearly and name what you needed to know and what information that might change. Then, when you're using information to avoid exposure, well, every answer creates five more questions. The decision becomes more complicated the longer you study it. And you start with a simple next step and somehow end up comparing 17 strategies, three certification options, 12 opinions, and a spreadsheet that, well, is really just a cry for help. That's one signal. More research may be helping if it's making the next step easier. It may be delaying action if it's making the next step feel a little further away. And I want to say this gently because I know how convincing that loop can feel when you're inside of it. The desire for just one more piece of information might feel like it's your intuition talking. It might feel like a wise inner warning. And it might feel like your body is saying just, oh, not yet. But sometimes not yet isn't your intuition. Sometimes it's the part of you that knows action is going to make the situation or the decision real. This is why you have to ask a different question. Instead of asking, do I know enough? Ask, what would I do if I decided I already knew enough to begin? That decision can be very revealing because if a clear next step immediately shows up, the issue may not be information. The issue might be willingness. And willingness, that's a whole different kind of work. You may know the next step is to send an email or make the appointment. Or, maybe in your case, it's just to tell the truth in one conversation instead of thinking about that conversation for another month. Who knows? If the next step is clear and you're still researching, you may not be looking for information anymore. You may be looking for emotional safety before you do something that can't be made completely safe. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. A lot of the women I talk to are waiting for clarity, but when we slow the conversation down, they do have clarity. They may not have the whole 10-year plan, but they often know what that next honest move is going to be. They can feel it, even if they haven't said it out loud yet. Something needs to change. Maybe it's saying no where they've been saying yes, or finally testing out a direction they've been circling for a while. It could be having that conversation we keep talking about. Whatever it is, there's an awareness that the current situation is costing them something: peace, confidence, or their sense of self trust. What they don't know is how to guarantee that the next move won't create any discomfort. And that's where the research becomes so appealing because research can feel cleaner than action. When you're researching, nothing's at risk yet. No one's reacting to you and misunderstanding you, and you're not standing in front of anybody trying something new and wondering how it's going to land. You're still in a space where everything is neatly contained, where the idea hasn't had to meet anybody else's interpretation or response. And that can feel a lot easier than stepping into a moment where you don't fully control how it's going to be received. Action's less tidy. Action creates feedback, and feedback is the thing we say we want until we remember that feedback may also include some silence, confusion, rejection, conflict, or that very annoying discovery that our first attempt was not, in fact, a complete masterpiece. So, of course, you'd rather research. Research gives you the feeling that you're doing something while protecting you from the consequences of doing the thing. But the price of that protection is high because the longer you research after you already have enough to begin, the more your self trust erodes. You tell yourself you're being careful, but somewhere inside of you, you know you're just delaying. That gap between what you say you're doing and what you know you're doing can become exhausting. And you start to lose respect for your own promises, the ones you say you're going to keep to yourself. You say, I'm going to start this week. And then you find a reason to prepare just a little bit more. You say, I'm going to have this conversation. And then you decide the timing's not right because the other person is, I don't know, stressed or you feel tired or Mercury is whatever Mercury's doing today. I'm not an astrologer. I just know Mercury gets blamed for a lot of administrative delays. Just saying. Maybe you're going to say, I'm going to choose the direction. And then you decide you should understand yourself just a little better first. Research gives you a temporary sense of control, but the waiting keeps costing you evidence that you can follow through. And that is what I care most about here. Not whether you make the perfect move, whether you keep building evidence that you can trust yourself to make an honest move. There's another reason research can become so seductive. It lets you stay in the identity of the person who could still do it beautifully, but later on. When the project stays in planning mode, it really just gets to remain perfect. When the conversation never leaves your head, you can rehearse it until every word sounds exactly right and you are guaranteed you know the outcome. And when the business, the book, the boundary, or whatever chapter lives in research mode for you, well, you can keep believing that that polished version is happening without ever really having to test it in real life. Does that make sense? Action introduces reality. Maybe your first draft is awkward, but the project shows you that what you thought you wanted to change actually needs to change. And that can feel threatening if you've attached your identity to being perfect, thoughtful, and prepared. It's hard to be both a beginner and a perfectionist. I know, I've tried. Research can let you keep the fantasy of competence fully intact. You don't have to be bad at something if you never leave preparation. But the cost is that you never get the feedback that would actually make you better. And this is where a lot of intelligent women get stuck. Your mind is a powerful tool and you can think through consequences. You can spot problems and imagine scenarios other people may miss. But that same mind can also create an endless hallway where every answer just leads to another door. And at some point, thinking stops creating clarity because the question can only be answered by contact with real life situations. You cannot know exactly how the conversation is going to go before you have it. And you can't know whether the project is going to work before you test it. And you definitely cannot know whether a direction fits by studying it forever from a distance. Some information is only available after you do it. I know that's inconvenient. I would also prefer to receive a full written report from the universe before making any significant decision in my life, ideally formatted clearly with a conclusion that says, Holly, this is the correct answer. Please proceed in this direction. But apparently, that department of the universe remains completely understaffed. So we work with what we have. And what we usually have is just enough information for the next step, not the entire path. That distinction matters. You may not know whether this is going to become your new career or not, but you may know enough to have one conversation with somebody already doing the work. You might not know whether that relationship is going to change after you tell the truth, but you may know enough to say, I need to talk about something that's been on my mind. And you may not know whether your project is going to be a success, but you do know enough to create the first rough version and let it be seen by at least one trusted person who can give you some real feedback. That is where research has to hand the keys to action because not because you know everything, but because you know enough to learn the next thing by doing it. Now, a useful way to test this is to ask, what information am I still missing and what decision would that information change? And this question really cuts through a lot because if you can name the missing information and explain how it's going to affect your choice, research may actually still be useful. And maybe what's still unclear is something super practical, like what it's going to cost or how much time it's going to take, or if that deadline has any flexibility depending on who's involved and whether they're available or not. That's practical information, so go get it. But if the information that's missing is vague, like I need to understand the whole thing better, or I need to feel certain, well, then you may not be looking for information anymore. You may be looking for a guarantee. And guarantees are very different from facts. A fact can help you decide. A guarantee is an attempt to remove vulnerability from your decision. And that's usually where the waiting hides, isn't it? You can research facts, but there's a point where research stops being about information and starts being about trying to protect yourself from what might happen next. You can't research your way into never being misunderstood or disappointed. And you can't research your way into a perfect first attempt. At some point, the thing you're trying to avoid isn't a lack of information, it's the reality that comes with actually doing it. And at some point, the thing you want to know is only available on the other side of that next step. That doesn't mean the step has to be huge. I think that's where a lot of people get this whole thing wrong. They realize research has become avoidance and then they swing towards some dramatic action to prove they're finally moving, something big. And I'm here to tell you, you don't need to make the biggest move possible. You need to make the next honest move. The step should be small enough that you can take it without feeling like you're going to blow up your life, and meaningful enough that it puts you in contact with reality. So if you're researching a career direction, the next honest step could be having one conversation with somebody in that field, not getting a new certification, but just one conversation that helps you test whether this interest is going to, you know, survive the actual work. And if you're researching how to have a hard conversation, the next honest step might be writing that first sentence you're going to say, not the entire script, just the opening that gets the conversation out of your head and into the room. Maybe you're researching a creative project. For you, the next honest step may be making one imperfect version and showing it to one person whose feedback you trust, not building the brand, the website, the LLC, the full strategy, and the TED Talk before anybody sees anything. A next honest step interrupts the fantasy and gives you real information. And that's the whole point, not to force yourself into a giant leap, but to stop confusing preparation with progress. You'll know you've found a useful step when it creates just a little bit of exposure, not unsafe exposure, not reckless, just enough that the idea has to meet reality. You might send a message or ask a question you've been circling, and then you just let somebody respond. That's when the real information begins, when you put it into the world and get some real reactions. And yes, that can be uncomfortable. And the discomfort may not mean you're unprepared, though. It may mean you've reached the part where preparation can't protect you anymore. This is where self trust really begins to grow, because self trust isn't built by knowing every possible outcome well in advance. It's built when you take a grounded step and stay with yourself through whatever happens next, good, bad, or otherwise. You learn that you can handle that messy first attempt. You're going to learn that somebody's response might be a little uncomfortable, but it's not going to be catastrophic. And you can learn that a direction can become so much more clear after you become testing it out. You might also learn that you can adjust without turning the first step into a failure. Research can tell you what others experienced. Action tells you what happens when you enter that equation. And that's the information that you've been missing all along. This is why the question isn't, have I researched enough to guarantee this is going to go well? The real question is, have I researched enough to take the next honest step? And those are two very different standards. The first standard keeps you waiting because it asks research to take away all the risk. The second lets research do its actual job, which is to help you move with more awareness. Once research has done that, continuing to gather information may not be wisdom at all. It may just be delayed action. So here's a conversation I want you to have with yourself the next time you catch yourself collecting more information. Start gently. You're not allowed to turn this into another opportunity to criticize yourself. That would be very on brand for those inner critics out there, and we're not going to give her the microphone today. Ask yourself what you might be protecting by staying in research mode. Sometimes it's not about needing more information. It's about not wanting to feel exposed. Maybe it's the possibility of being judged or the discomfort of finding out that your first attempt isn't what you hoped it was going to be. Just notice what comes up when you consider that. There will usually be something really valuable there. Then ask what information would genuinely help you take the next step. And be specific. If there's a real fact missing, please go get that fact. But if the answer is that you want to feel certain or confident or immune to regret, name that honestly too, because that isn't research. That's just waiting. And once you can see it, you can stop asking information to do a job it can't do. Then choose the smallest action that would put you in contact with reality, not the action that proves you're brave or the action that changes your entire life. Choose the action that gives you some real, honest feedback. This is the part many women skip because feedback can feel like judgment. But feedback isn't always judgment. Sometimes feedback is simply information you could not access while you were standing still in that one waiting position. You might start to notice that what you thought you wanted shifts a little once you're actually in it, or that the thing that you were bracing for doesn't land the way you expected. And sometimes the feeling you were trying to avoid shows up, but it doesn't stay as long or hit as hard as you imagined it would. And that difference, that evidence, that matters. It's got a different weight than another article or opinion or another saved post on Instagram. You can build a whole private world inside research, but self trust needs contact with the real world. That's the part that can't be outsourced. No one else can research enough for you to feel completely safe. And nobody else can give you the exact right answer that eliminates the vulnerability of making a decision. And I know that can sound frustrating if you're tired or overwhelmed or afraid of doing the wrong thing, but it can also be freeing because you may not be as far from action as you think. You may not need another 30, 60, or 90 days of preparation. You may just need one sentence. Maybe it's just one email you've been putting off or one conversation you keep rehearsing but haven't had yet. Or even just sitting down for an hour and actually working on the project that you want to do instead of just thinking about it. Sometimes it's less about doing something big and more about deciding you're done using research as a place to wait. So think about the thing you keep researching, the choice, the conversation, the project, whatever, and ask yourself what you already know. Not everything, just what you know. Then ask what information is genuinely missing from the equation. If there's a fact you need, go get it. If there's no fact missing, if what you're really waiting for is certainty or guarantee that nobody's going to judge you or that you won't fail, then please be honest enough to say that because the honesty matters. Once you can name that real fear, you can meet it more directly, more head on. If what's underneath all of this is the fear of being judged or rejected, or even just the discomfort of seeing your first attempt not match what you had imagined, more information isn't going to fix that. Because at some point, you've got to meet that feeling directly instead of trying to out research it. The next honest step is what gives you the evidence. And evidence is what begins to rebuild trust. Now, before we finish, I'd like to hear what this looks like in your life. So complete this sentence. I keep researching, fill in the blank, but the action I may be avoiding is fill in the blank. You can reply to the DMs or you can leave me a message at Holly Toscanini on Instagram, or you can email me at holly@hollytoscanini.com. One sentence is really enough. And I'm asking because I'm paying close attention to where women are stuck between knowing enough and allowing themselves to be seen taking the next step. Next week, we're talking about how to hear yourself when everybody else is in your head. Sometimes those voices belong to people who are actively giving you advice, and sometimes they're people whose reactions you're trying to predict. Sometimes they're old expectations you've carried for so long that now they sound like your own thoughts. We're going to talk about how to separate what you want from what you've been taught to want, and why asking for another opinion doesn't always bring you closer to your own answer. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Until next time, bye for now.
Thank you for tuning in to How to Lose the Weight. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. And if you found value in this episode, I'd love it if you could leave a review. It really helps the show reach more women like you who are ready to step into their power. For more insights and inspiration, follow me on Instagram at Holly Toscanini or visit hollytoscanini.com. Until next time, remember, stop waiting and start living.